An 8-year-old homeless girl walks into a luxurious private hospital, doubled over in severe abdominal pain and desperately begging for medical help. The newly hired receptionist treats her with cruel disdain, shouting, "We don't treat beggars here. This is a hospital for people of class." When the weak and trembling girl pleads through tears for someone to simply look at her pain, she is pushed toward the door and collapses on the marble floor. At that moment, a man who had been quietly watching steps in. Arthur felt the invisible weight of his own fortune like a heavy coat on a summer day. There, sitting in one of the impeccably white leather armchairs in the lobby of his newest hospital, he was just another face in the crowd. He wore a simple wool blazer, chinos, and shoes that had seen better days, a perfect disguise for the billionaire who could buy and sell the entire city block before lunch. He enjoyed doing this, blending into the daily life of his businesses to feel their true pulse. What reports and profit spreadsheets never showed was the soul of a place. And that was what he had come to find. The Claremont Medical Center was the latest jewel in his investment crown, an institution that promised the best care money could buy. The air was crisp and purified, with the faint scent of lilies wafting from a monumental arrangement near the reception desk. The marble floor shone so brightly it reflected the soft ceiling lights, and a classical melody floated in the air, so discreet it was more like a sigh. Everything was perfect, perhaps too perfect. It lacked warmth, lacked the comforting messiness of real life. His thoughts drifted to his daughter, Sophia, to the sound of her laughter that once filled every silence. The pain, even after so many years, was an ember that never fully went out. And it was in her name that he built hospitals, schools, shelters. Every brick of his empire was a silent tribute to her memory, an attempt to create a world a little kinder than the one that had taken her. He watched the receptionist, a severe-looking young woman named Beatrice, whose smile seemed rehearsed to please only the clients who looked to have a robust bank account. She was attending to an elderly couple with an almost exaggerated deference, her voice like smooth honey. Arthur frowned. This wasn't what he'd envisioned. Compassion should be universal, not selective. It was then that the automatic glass doors slid silently open, revealing a figure that shattered the sterile harmony of the room. A little girl, no more than 8, small and thin, with tangled hair and a face smudged with soot and dried tears. Her clothes were torn and far too thin for the biting wind that blew outside. She was hunched over, one hand pressed hard against her stomach, her face twisted into a mask of sharp pain. Every hesitant step she took across the polished marble was a silent cry for help. Heads turned. Venomous whispers began to ripple through the lobby. The girl, ignoring everyone, walked unsteadily to the reception desk, her large brown eyes fixed on Beatrice, filled with a desperate hope. She leaned on the cold marble counter to keep from falling, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Please!" Her voice was a faint thread, almost inaudible. "My tummy! It hurts so much! Help me, please!" Beatrice looked up from her computer screen, her professional smile instantly melting into a scowl of pure disgust. She scanned the girl from head to toe, the contempt in her gaze as sharp as a scalpel. The silence in the lobby grew heavy, dense, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Arthur felt his heart clench. The ember of loss flaring into a cold flame of indignation. He leaned forward, ready to rise. Then the receptionist's voice cut through the silence, loud, clear, and cruel for all to hear. "We don't treat vagrants here. This is a world-class facility, not a free clinic." Beatrice's words fell into the silent lobby like shards of ice, shattering the atmosphere of sophistication and calm. The pianist playing softly in the background seemed to miss a note. An elegant couple examining a hospital brochure looked up, shocked. Arthur felt his blood boil, a wave of heat rising in his chest, his muscles tensed, instinct screaming for him to stand up and cross the hall in 3 long strides to end this humiliation. but he forced himself to remain seated, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of the chair. This was his method, his golden rule: observe. Only in anonymity could he see the true face of the people who worked for him, the culture that formed far from his sight. Revealing his identity now would be like turning on the house lights in the middle of a play. Everyone would start performing, but every second of inaction was a betrayal of Sophia's memory. The girl, whose name was Leah, though no one there knew it, flinched as if she had been slapped. The tears, which had been silent before, now flowed freely down her dirty cheeks. She shook her head, her voice a trembling sob. "No, ma'am, I'm just in pain. A lot of pain." She tried to straighten up, but a fresh wave of cramps made her double over again, a low moan escaping her lips. What was all his wealth worth, all his assets and investments, if he sat paralyzed, watching cruelty unfold right in front of him? Money built walls, but it couldn't, on its own, instill compassion in human hearts. Beatrice, however, seemed determined to prove her point. With an impatient gesture and a huff of disdain, she picked up the phone on her desk. "Security to the main reception, please. We have a situation." The word situation was spoken with the same tone one might use to describe trash spilled on the floor. Two men in navy blue uniforms, tall and broad-shouldered, emerged from a side corridor. Their faces were impassive, trained not to show emotion. They walked to the desk, and Beatrice pointed to Leah with a flick of her chin. "Please escort the girl to the exit. She's disturbing our clients." The security guards glanced at each other for a fraction of a second. One of them, an older man with graying hair at his temples, had a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He looked at the small figure bent in pain, then at the unyielding receptionist. But orders were orders. They approached Leah. The younger one reached out, not to grab her, but to touch her shoulder gently. "Come on, kid, you can't stay here." At the touch, Leah startled. She took a step back, her eyes wide with panic. "No, please, don't touch me. I just need a doctor. Mommy always said hospitals are where people help you." Arthur closed his eyes. The mention of her mother was a dagger in his own wounded heart. He could almost hear Sophia's small, confident voice saying something similar. Arthur's internal battle reached an unbearable peak. His disguise, his mission of observation, all of it seemed ridiculous and cowardly in the face of this child's real and immediate suffering. The older guard sighed, his face etched with visible reluctance. He knelt slowly, trying to get down to Leah's eye level. "We're not going to hurt you," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But you have to go. It's the rules." Leah stared at him, tears carving clean little rivers through the dust on her face. She looked at the people around her, their gazes averted, their faces turned into masks of indifference. No one would help her. The understanding hit her with a devastating force, and with it, the last spark of her strength was extinguished. Her small body went limp, her eyes rolling back in her head. "I can't," she whispered, her voice fading, and her legs finally gave way, her frail body starting to crumple sideways toward the hard and cold marble floor. Leah's world spun into a spiral of pain and darkness before her body even hit the ground. The dull thud of her fall echoed through the silent lobby, a shocking, definitive sound that made everyone start. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. The pianist stopped playing, leaving a heavy, accusatory silence in the air. The elegant couple gasped, the woman bringing a hand to her mouth in horror. Beatrice, the receptionist, took a step back, her face pale, not with concern, but with irritation. "Great, now look what she's done," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "Get her out of here, quickly, before someone important sees this unpleasant scene." Arthur could no longer restrain himself. The barrier he had built between the anonymous observer and the man of action disintegrated. He rose to his feet, the leather armchair groaning in protest. The movement was so abrupt that a few heads turned his way, but no one paid him any special attention. He was just another stranger in modest clothes. His heart hammered against his ribs, a mixture of fury and a piercing pain that was terribly familiar to him. The image of little Leah, motionless on the floor, superimposed itself on a memory he tried to suppress every day. Sophia, in a hospital bed, as pale and fragile as this little girl. The guards' hesitation turned into a paralyzing confusion. They looked at the unconscious body, then at Beatrice, whose eyes were shooting daggers of command, and then at the small audience of horrified onlookers. The older guard, whose name was Jonas, felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't signed up for this, to drag sick children out onto the street, but Beatrice's shrill voice snapped him out of his stupor. "What are you waiting for? An invitation? Grab her by the arms and get her out of here. Now!" It was the last straw. Arthur crossed the lobby, his steps firm and silent on the marble. He ignored the curious glances, the palpable tension, the entire world. His focus was solely on the child. He knelt beside Leah, concern etched into every line on his face. With a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew his ruthless reputation in the business world, he touched her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there, a thin, frightened thread of life. He looked at her face, her eyelids closed, her long eyelashes dark against her pale skin. She was so small, so helpless. The anger gave way to a cold, steel-like determination. "Stand back," he said in a low voice, but it was laden with an authority that made both security guards instinctively retreat. Without waiting for a response, he slipped one arm under Leah's knees and the other under her shoulders. Lifting her from the floor, she was terrifyingly light, like a little bird with fragile bones. The heat of her small, feverish body seeped through the fabric of his blazer. As he stood up, the unconscious girl in his arms, he finally faced Beatrice. His eyes, normally a calm, thoughtful blue, were now stormy. Beatrice stared back at him, first with surprise, then with indignation. "Who do you think you are?" she spat. "You can't just pick her up. Put her down. She is not our patient." Arthur ignored her completely. He turned, beginning to walk with firm, determined steps toward the corridor that led to the emergency room. His net worth, his stocks on Wall Street, none of it mattered in that moment. The only valuable asset was this child's life. "Where do you think you're going?" Beatrice shouted, her face red with fury. "I'm talking to you." "Stop right now! Security! Detain him!" The guards, galvanized by the direct order, hurried to catch up with him. Jonas, the older one, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sir, please, you can't do this." Arthur stopped. He didn't turn around, but his voice was cutting. "Take your hand off me. This girl needs a doctor, not a doorman." The firmness in his tone made Jonas pull his hand back, as if he had touched fire. Meanwhile, a hysterical Beatrice ran after them, her high heels clicking on the marble. "He's kidnapping her. Somebody call the police. He can't take her to the ER. Someone has to pay for this. Nothing here is free." The chase through the immaculate corridors of the Claremont Medical Center was a surreal scene. On one side, a man of ordinary appearance, but with an unshakable resolve, carrying a fragile child like a precious treasure. On the other, a furious receptionist, followed by two hesitant security guards, their voices echoing off the marble walls and creating a cacophony of indignation and desperation. "Stop! You have no right!" Beatrice continued to scream, her professional composure completely shattered, revealing an ugliness that no elegant uniform could hide. "The protocols are clear. She needs to be admitted. We need ID, a guardian, proof of insurance, or a down payment." Arthur didn't slow his pace. Every shout from her was fuel for his urgency. Leah's body in his arms seemed to grow warmer, and a soft moan escaped her lips, a sound that pierced his heart deeper than any insult. He could feel her feverish trembling through his clothes. He knew about protocols. He had written them. He also knew that the first rule of any medical oath, of any healthcare institution worth its name, was to save a life. Everything else was bureaucracy, paperwork, the kind of thing his vast capital could solve with a single phone call. But right now, in this hallway, he was just one man against a system he himself had created, and which had, somehow, become inhuman. The commotion attracted attention. Nurses and doctors stepped out of their rooms, their faces marked by curiosity and disapproval. They saw an unknown man, a street kid in his arms, and a panicked employee. The conclusion was obvious and wrong. A younger doctor, in a starched white coat and an arrogant air, stood in Arthur's path, blocking his way. "Sir, what's going on here? You can't just barge into the ER like this." At his side, 2 other nurses joined, forming a human barrier. "The receptionist is right," one of them said, her voice firm but less aggressive. "We need to follow procedure to ensure the best care." Arthur looked at the faces before him. They weren't monsters, they were cogs in a machine. Employees following the rules, protecting their jobs and the institution. They didn't see a dying child. They saw an irregularity, a breach of protocol, a problem. "Procedure can wait," Arthur said, his voice low and tense. "Her life can't." The arrival of a man in a grey suit, better tailored than Arthur's, and with an expression of sour authority, heightened the tension. It was Richard Vance, the hospital's administrative director, a man Arthur had personally hired for his reputation for efficiency and cost management. "What is the meaning of all this commotion?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp. Beatrice rushed to him, relieved. "Mr. Vance, thank God. This man, he picked up this girl off the street and is trying to force his way into the ER. She has no papers, no way to pay. He's causing a disturbance." Richard sized up Arthur with a dismissive glance. He saw the simple blazer, the worn shoes. His expression hardened. "Sir, I'm asking you to hand the child over to security and leave immediately. If you fail to do so, I will be forced to call the police for trespassing and disturbing the peace." The threat hung in the air, cold and final. Arthur felt Leah's small body tremble again. Time was running out. The rage he felt was a contained storm, but he knew losing his temper wouldn't help. He had to play their game, at least for another moment. He looked directly into the eyes of Richard, the director who prided himself on increasing profits and shareholder dividends, but who seemed to have forgotten the fundamental purpose of this place. With a calm that belied the fury within him, Arthur said the words he knew they would understand. "Fine, I'll pay for her." A ripple of surprise passed over the employees' faces. Beatrice frowned, suspicious. Richard raised an eyebrow. "You'll pay. Do you have any idea what an emergency treatment costs at this hospital?" Arthur didn't flinch. "I have some idea." But his answer wasn't enough. Richard, instead of clearing the path, crossed his arms. "Very well, then let's go to admissions. We'll need a deposit, your ID, a completed liability form, and the girl. Does she have any identification, a birth certificate, anything?" The bureaucratic barrier was more impenetrable than the physical one. They were willing to let a child suffer while they argued over paperwork and money. Arthur looked at Leah's pale face, feeling the urgency like a knife in his chest. Her life was slipping away while they debated the price. Richard's demand for upfront payment and documents was like a brick wall erected in front of Arthur. He looked at the face of the administrative director, a man whose career he himself had launched, and saw only the cold logic of a business manager. Blind to the human tragedy unfolding in his arms, the irony was crushing. He, the owner of it all, the man whose name signed these people's paychecks, was being blocked by rules that ultimately served to protect his own investments. But what were all his assets worth, all his gold and stock portfolios, if they couldn't buy a simple act of compassion? "She is a child," Arthur said, his voice dangerously calm. "She is unconscious. She doesn't have a wallet with an ID and a credit card. She has a pain that could kill her. Isn't that enough?" Richard let out an impatient sigh, as if explaining something obvious to a fool. "Sir, this is one of the most expensive hospitals in the country. We have state-of-the-art equipment, the best specialists. All of that comes at a cost. We can't just open our doors to anyone. It would be financial chaos. Our responsibility is to our paying patients and to the sustainability of the business." Every word was another nail in the coffin of Arthur's hope that there was any humanity beneath the corporate veneer. The sustainability of the business was being placed above a little girl's life. The fire in his chest, once aflame, was now a raging inferno. He had to act, but revealing his identity there, in that tense hallway, would turn everything into a circus. He had to save Leah first, then deal with the rot he had uncovered. As the argument unfolded, Jonas, the older security guard, watched the scene with a heavy heart. He had seen many things in his years of work, but the casual cruelty of Beatrice and the calculated indifference of Richard sickened him. He looked at the girl in the stranger's arms. She looked so small, so much like his own granddaughter. Doubt gnawed at him. Should he follow his orders or his conscience? It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that changed everything. One of the nurses blocking the path, a middle-aged woman with kind, weary eyes named Helen, took a small step to the side. Her eyes met Arthur's for a fraction of a second, and in that brief glance he saw a silent alliance. She saw the genuine desperation in his eyes, the fever on the girl's skin. She had been a nurse for 30 years. She knew a real emergency when she saw one. Helen's gesture was enough. Arthur didn't hesitate. He took advantage of the small opening and pushed forward, past the arrogant doctor and the other nurse. "Hey!" Richard yelled, caught by surprise. "Stop him!" But it was too late. Arthur was already at the threshold of the emergency wing. The atmosphere changed instantly. The oppressive silence of the hallway was replaced by the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the hum of equipment, and the calm but urgent voices of the medical staff. An ER doctor on duty, Dr. Marcus Allen, a tired-looking man with alert eyes, saw them enter and immediately approached. "What have we got?" he asked, his attention focused entirely on Leah. "She collapsed in the lobby," Arthur said, ignoring the chaos he'd left behind, "complaining of severe abdominal pain. She has a fever." Dr. Allen didn't ask about payment or paperwork. He saw a child in distress. With a nod, he indicated an empty gurney. "Get her on here, Helen. Get vitals. I need an IV line and a CBC now." The ER team sprang into action with impressive efficiency, a ballet of professionalism and urgency. In seconds, Leah was on the gurney, with Helen taking her blood pressure and Dr. Allen listening to her heart. Richard, Beatrice and the guards stopped at the doorway, watching the scene, and their objections dying on their lips in the face of medical reality. Their authority ended where the emergency began. Arthur stepped back, allowing the professionals to work, but never taking his eyes off Leah. He felt a wave of relief so intense, his legs felt weak. She was safe, and for now. But the battle was far from over. Richard approached him, his face a mask of contained fury. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low so as not to disturb the team. "You've broken every rule we have. As soon as her situation is stable, we are going to have a very serious conversation, and you can be sure the bill will be astronomical." Arthur finally turned to face the director. For the first time, a cold, mirthless smile touched his lips. "You can be sure we will," he said. "We'll have a conversation you will never forget." While the emergency team worked on Leah with focused competence, the world outside that treatment room seemed a stage of rising tensions. Arthur remained near the door, a silent guardian, his gaze alternating between the small figure on the gurney and the indignant group forming in the hallway. Richard, the director, kept a calculated distance, his face rigid with anger and humiliation at having his authority publicly challenged. Beatrice, the receptionist, whispered with the younger security guard, casting venomous glances in Arthur's direction, clearly constructing a narrative in which she was the victim and he the villain. Only Jonas, the older guard, remained silent, the conflict plain on his face. Arthur's initial relief at getting Leah medical attention quickly gave way to a mounting anxiety. He watched monitors display numbers he didn't understand, but whose alarming colors and sounds signaled gravity. Helen, the nurse, moved with impressive calm, administering medication and adjusting equipment. Dr. Allen, his brow furrowed, examined Leah's abdomen, pressing gently in different spots. Even unconscious, the girl moaned in pain, a sound that made Arthur's heart constrict. Time dragged on. Every minute felt like an hour. Arthur began to pace, a habit he detested, but it was the only outlet for the nervous energy consuming him. He thought about how life could change in an instant. An hour ago, he was a billionaire in disguise, analyzing the efficiency of one of his businesses. Now, he was the sole advocate for a parentless child whose life was hanging by a thread. The fragility of it all hit him hard. What was the point of building an empire of fortune and power if he couldn't stop a child from suffering due to sheer indifference? Finally, Dr. Allen approached him, his face serious. "We've stabilized her for now, but the situation is delicate. Initial exams and the rigidity of her abdomen suggest acute appendicitis, likely already ruptured. We need to do an emergency ultrasound to confirm, but all signs point to her needing immediate surgery." The words "immediate surgery" echoed in Arthur's mind. It was serious, more serious than he had feared. "Do whatever it takes," he said, his voice firm. "Use the best you have. Cost is not an issue." Dr. Allen nodded, but then his expression grew more complicated. "That's where we have a problem. To perform the surgery, I need an informed consent signed by a legal guardian, and frankly, all of her data for the medical record, full name, age, medical history. We have nothing." Bureaucracy, once again, reared its ugly head. The same wall he had faced in the corridor now materialized inside the emergency room. The irony was cruel. The system designed to protect patients was, at that moment, putting Leah's life at risk. From outside, Richard overheard the conversation. He saw his chance to regain control. He strode into the room, his expression triumphant. "You see, Doctor? This is what I was trying to explain to this gentleman. Without the proper documentation, our hands are tied. It's a legal matter. If we operate without consent and something goes wrong, the hospital could be sued. It's a liability we cannot take on." The word liability, used to describe a child's life, made Arthur see red. He turned to Richard, and for the first time, the mask of the common man began to crack, revealing the force of a business titan accustomed to demolishing obstacles, not circumventing them. "Are you telling me," Arthur began, his voice dangerously low, "that you're going to let this little girl die on a gurney because of a form?" Richard shrugged, a gesture of false helplessness. "Those are the rules. I don't make them, I just enforce them. It's for everyone's protection." At that moment, as Leah's life hung in the balance, Arthur knew the time for observation was over. The injustice wasn't just an isolated act by a cruel receptionist. It was a systemic cancer, a culture of indifference that prioritized profit over life. And he, as the owner, was ultimately responsible. He needed to make a decision, and fast. The surgery couldn't wait. But how could he sign a consent form for a child he didn't even know? What legal right did he have? He was a stranger. A wealthy stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. The trap was perfect. If he did nothing, Leah might not survive. If he forced the issue, he could be committing an illegal act, giving Richard and the others the perfect ammunition to get rid of him and the problem he had brought in. And in the midst of this dilemma, Leah moaned again on the gurney, a weak, desperate sound that cut through the air and through Arthur's heart, reminding him that the clock was ticking. The standoff in the emergency room was absolute. On one side, the cold logic of law and regulations, personified by Richard. On the other, the desperate urgency of life, represented by Arthur and Leah's shallow breathing. Dr. Allen and Nurse Helen watched, trapped between their professional duty to save the patient and the rigid hospital guidelines that could cost them their jobs. Arthur felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. His entire life had been built around calculated decisions, risk analysis, and return on investment. But there was no spreadsheet that could quantify the value of Leah's life. He closed his eyes for a second, and Sophia's smiling face appeared in his mind, a ghost from a happy past. "Daddy, if you can help, you should always." The memory of her words, spoken years ago when they found a bird with a broken wing in the garden, was the spark he needed. He opened his eyes, his hesitation swept away by a new, unshakable resolve. He would not be the man who stood by and watched history repeat itself. He looked at Richard, not with anger, but with a kind of cold pity. "You talk about liability," Arthur said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "The greatest liability this hospital could ever have is the death of a child in our hallway due to negligence. A scandal that no amount of money could ever fix. Think of the reputational damage. Think of the headlines." Arthur was using the only language Richard understood, that of business, of profit and loss. The director's face faltered for an instant. He hadn't thought of that. He was so focused on the internal rules that he had forgotten about the world outside. But his arrogance kept him from yielding. "Is that a threat?" he shot back, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. "It's a fact," Arthur corrected. "Now, prepare the operating room. I am taking full and complete responsibility, legal and financial." "You can't," Richard insisted. "You're a nobody. You have no legal authority over her." And then Arthur did something that would change the course of that day and of many lives forever. He turned to Dr. Allen. "Doctor, what is your name?" The physician, startled, replied, "Marcus, Dr. Marcus Allen." "Dr. Allen," Arthur continued, his tone now calm and commanding, "prep your team. I guarantee you will have no legal repercussions. You have my word." He then turned to Helen. "Nurse, your name?" "Helen Carter," she answered, her voice a little shaky. "Ms. Carter, please continue monitoring the girl and get her ready for surgery. Ignore any orders to the contrary." What happened next was a turning point, a moment no one there could have predicted. Arthur took a simple cell phone from the inside pocket of his blazer, an old model he used to avoid attracting attention. He dialed a single number from his contact list. The phone rang only once before it was answered. "Yes, sir," a professional voice said on the other end. Arthur didn't bother to lower his voice. He wanted everyone to hear. "Good Edward, it's Arthur. I'm at the Claremont Medical Center in the ER. I need you to do two things immediately. First, wire $5 million into a contingency fund in this hospital's name, available immediately to cover any and all expenses. Second, call Dr. Aldrich, the chairman of the board, and tell him I'm here and that he is to grant full and unrestricted authority to Dr. Marcus Allen to proceed with an emergency surgery on an unidentified pediatric patient under my personal responsibility. And Edward..." Arthur paused, looking directly at Richard, whose face was shifting through shades of confusion, disbelief, and a growing dread. "Tell Dr. Aldrich that the administrative director, Richard Vance, is terminated, and the morning shift receptionist, Beatrice, as well. The terminations are effective immediately. For cause, security will escort them off the property." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady beep of Leah's heart monitor. Jaws dropped. Helen's eyes went wide. Dr. Allen stared at him, stunned. Richard turned as white as the marble floor. The word "sir" spoken over the phone, the name Dr. Aldrich, the absurd figure of $5 million, the order of termination. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place in everyone's mind, forming an unbelievable picture. This man in simple clothes, whom they had treated with disdain and suspicion, was not an intruder. He was not some madman. He was Arthur Sterling, the Arthur Sterling, the man who owned everything. The revelation landed in the emergency room like a silent bomb, redrawing the landscape of power in an instant. The name Arthur Sterling hung in the air, freighted with the weight of an almost unimaginable fortune and an influence that spanned continents. He was a near mythical figure in the business world, known for his investment genius and his aversion to publicity. To see him there in the flesh, wearing clothes that cost no more than a few $100s, was something their minds struggled to process. Richard was the first to recover from the shock, but his reaction was one of abject panic. The color drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly, ashen pallor. His legs seemed to lose their strength, and he leaned against a counter to keep from falling. Mr. Sterling, he stammered, his voice unrecognizable. I didn't know. I was just following protocol, protecting the hospital, protecting your assets. The excuse sounded hollow, pathetic, even to his own ears. Arthur met his gaze with a look that held no anger, but something far worse. Disappointment. A cold, profound disappointment. You were protecting profit at the expense of a life. You turned a place of healing into a currency exchange where compassion has a price tag. My assets are not just made of money, Richard. They are made of principles, and you violated the most important one. He turned away, dismissing Richard as if he were no longer worthy of his attention, and focused on what mattered. Dr. Allen, time is critical. Please proceed. Dr. Allen, still stunned, shook his head as if to clear it. The hesitation in his eyes was replaced by a spark of admiration and relief. Yes, sir, immediately. He turned to Helen. Let's move, Helen. Notify the OR. I want that operating room ready in 10 minutes. The team, once paralyzed by bureaucracy, now moved with a new energy, driven by the clarity of purpose and Arthur's unquestionable authority. As they prepped Leah for transport, Richard's cell phone vibrated. He looked at the screen, his face contorting into a mask of despair. It was Dr. Aldrich, the chairman of the board, the final blow. Beatrice, who had been watching from the hallway, saw Richard's expression and knew, instinctively, that her own fate was sealed. She took a step back, trying to blend into the wall, as if invisibility could save her from the consequences of her cruelty. Arthur, however, had not forgotten her. His gaze found her in the hall, and she shrank under the weight of that silent scrutiny. He didn't have to say a word. Jonas and the other guard approached her and Richard, their expressions now solemn. "Sir, ma'am, please come with us," Jonas said, his voice firm but without malice. The humiliation of being escorted out by the same security staff they had commanded moments before was the final punishment. As Leah's gurney was wheeled down the corridor toward the surgical elevator, Arthur walked beside her. He gently placed his hand on her head, brushing a stray lock of tangled hair from her forehead. She was still pale, but her breathing seemed a little less labored. The machine he had set in motion was now working perfectly, but the relief he felt was tinged with a deep sadness. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the revelation of the rotten culture that had taken root in his hospital opened a much larger wound. It wasn't just about Richard and Beatrice. It was about a system that allowed such attitudes to flourish. How many other Leahs had been turned away from that door? How many people in despair had been judged by their clothes instead of their symptoms? The weight of that responsibility was crushing. He followed the gurney to the double doors of the surgical area, where he could go no further. Helen paused for a moment before passing through. "We'll take good care of her." "Mr. Sterling," she said, and for the first time, Arthur saw not just respect in her eyes, but genuine gratitude. "I know you will," he replied, his voice a bit hoarse. "Please keep me updated." The doors swung shut, leaving him alone in the quiet corridor. The man who could move markets with a word was now helpless. reduced to waiting like any other anxious relative. The adrenaline began to fade, giving way to an overwhelming exhaustion. He sank onto a nearby bench, his head in his hands. Saving Leah's life was only the beginning. He knew the real challenge would begin when she came out of that operating room. What would happen to her? An orphan, alone in the world. Saving her from appendicitis wouldn't save her from a life on the streets. That problem couldn't be solved with an order or a wire transfer. It would require something far more valuable: time, care, connection. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur felt afraid, not of business complexities, but of the enormous, delicate responsibility he had just taken on for the future of a little stranger. The next few hours crawled by with torturous slowness. The sterile corridor, once the stage for a dramatic confrontation, was now a sanctuary of silence and waiting. Arthur remained on his bench, the wool blazer suddenly feeling ill-fitting and heavy. He refused offers of coffee or water from nurses, who now passed him with reverent glances. His mind, usually a whirlwind of business strategies and market analyses, was strangely quiet, focused on a single point: the light above the operating room doors. He thought about Leah. Who was she? Where did she come from? The words she had murmured in the lobby echoed in his head. Mommy always said hospitals are where people help you. Where was this mother now? The innocence of that phrase, the childlike faith in a world that had proven so cruel, was heartbreaking. That thought led him to a flashback, a memory he kept locked in a dusty vault in his mind. Sophia, 6 years old, coming home from school, crying because a classmate had said her drawing of a blue dog was stupid. Arthur had picked her up, the smell of crayons and childhood enveloping him, and told her that the world could be mean sometimes. But she should never stop coloring her dogs whatever color her heart desired. He had taught his daughter to believe in kindness, to trust people, and now he saw in Leah a distorted reflection of that same trust, brutally betrayed. The irony did not escape him. He had built an empire, a fortress of wealth and power, partly to protect Sophia from all harm. Yet money couldn't shield her from the illness that took her. And now, all that money had almost failed to protect another child from simple human cruelty. The corridor door opened, and Jonas, the security guard, approached hesitantly. He was holding a small, dirty, and worn canvas backpack. "Mr. Sterling," he said in a low voice, "I found this near the entrance. I think it belongs to the little girl." Arthur took the backpack. It was light. He opened it carefully, as if handling a fragile artifact. Inside, there were few possessions: a broken plastic comb, half a granola bar, and at the bottom, a small sketchbook with a worn cover. He opened it. The pages were filled with childish drawings, done with a single pencil. Drawings of a small house with smoke coming from the chimney, a smiling sun, and on several pages, a drawing of a man and a woman holding hands with a little girl in the middle, a family. On the last page, there was a more recent, less cheerful drawing. The same little girl, but now by herself, with tears falling from her eyes. Beneath the drawing, a single word was written in shaky, hesitant letters: alone. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. That simple word contained a universe of pain. This sketchbook was Leah's story. It was the backstory he had sensed, but now saw in pencil strokes. She wasn't a vagrant, as Beatrice had called her. She was a child who had lost everything. "Jonas," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, "have one of my assistants look into this, discreetly. I want to know what happened to her parents. Accidents, records, anything. I need to understand." "Yes, sir," Jonas replied, and there was a new kind of respect in his eyes, one that went beyond Arthur's position and acknowledged the man. As Jonas walked away, Dr. Allen finally emerged from the operating room doors. He'd changed out of his surgical scrubs into a clean white coat, but his face was marked by the fatigue of the long procedure. Arthur stood up instantly, his heart pounding. "How is she?" he asked, dreading the answer. Dr. Allen allowed himself a small, exhausted smile. "It was more complicated than we expected. The appendix had ruptured. There was a severe infection, but the surgery was a success. She's a fighter. She's in recovery now, stable. The next 48 hours will be critical, but I'm optimistic." A sigh of relief escaped Arthur's lips, so profound it left him dizzy. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you for everything." "I just did my job," the doctor said. You did much more." Arthur nodded, grateful, but his mind was already moving to the next challenge. The medical victory was immense, but it was only the first of many battles. He looked again at the sketchbook in his hands. Saving Leah's body from infection was one thing. Healing the wound left by the word alone was a completely different challenge, one that would require a type of investment not measured in dollars, euros, or stocks. It would require an investment of the soul. And looking toward the uncertain future, Arthur wondered if he, a man who had spent decades building a material empire, still had enough emotional capital for such a monumental task. The next 48 hours were a vigil. Arthur barely left the hospital. He had clean clothes sent over and turned a conference room adjacent to the pediatric ICU into his makeshift headquarters. From there, he managed his global empire with one hand and monitored Leah's fragile progress with the other. He would sit for hours by her bedside, watching her sleep under the effect of sedatives, her chest rising and falling to the steady rhythm of the monitors. Her face, now clean, had delicate features, and her long, dark eyelashes cast soft shadows on her cheeks. Seeing her there, so vulnerable, awakened a protective instinct in him that he thought he had buried with Sophia. Every beep of the machine, every positive update from the nurses was a small victory. The fever began to break and her vital signs stabilized. Leah's body, with the remarkable resilience of childhood, was fighting to heal. But Arthur knew the real battle hadn't even begun. While Leah slept, the investigation he had ordered progressed quickly. The information that came back was sober and tragic. Leah's parents, Marcus and Clara, had died just over 2 months ago in a car accident on a rural highway. They were simple, hard-working people with no close relatives who could take custody of their daughter. After the accident, Leah was placed temporarily in a state-run group home, but the place was overcrowded and chaotic. Frightened and grieving, she had run away after a few weeks, preferring the dangerous freedom of the streets to the depersonalization of the system. She had been surviving on her own ever since, sleeping in shelters when she could get a few dollars from begging, and in alleyways when she couldn't. The abdominal pain that had brought her to the hospital was the climax of weeks of malnutrition and stress. The story confirmed the depth of the abyss into which Leah had fallen. She wasn't just an orphan, she was an invisible survivor, one of the many children who fall through the cracks of a society that moves too fast to look down. Guilt weighed on Arthur. He dedicated enormous sums of his capital to philanthropic causes, but they were anonymous, distant donations managed by foundations. He had never come face to face with the human reality behind the statistics. Leah was that face. On the third day, Leah finally woke up. Arthur was by her bed, reading reports on a tablet. The first sound she made was a soft moan. He immediately set the tablet aside and leaned over her. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy and confused. She blinked several times, trying to focus. Her gaze traveled around the white room, the equipment, the IV in her hand, and finally landed on Arthur's face. There was fear in her eyes. Where am I?" she whispered, her throat dry. "You're safe," Arthur said, his voice as gentle as he could make it. "You're in a hospital. You were in a lot of pain, remember? The doctors took care of you." She frowned, the memory returning in fragments. The cold lobby, the mean woman, the pain, collapsing. She looked at Arthur with suspicion. "Who are you?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Who was he to her? A stranger who had saved her, a billionaire, a potential savior, or just another adult in a world of disappointing adults. "My name is Arthur," he said, opting for the simplest truth. "I saw you needed help, and I brought you here." Her eyes filled with tears. "The lady, she said they didn't treat—" "She was wrong," Arthur interrupted firmly. "Very wrong. This hospital is here to help everyone, especially children." He wanted to erase the memory of that cruelty, but he knew he couldn't. The emotional wounds were deeper than the surgical incision. In the days that followed, a delicate routine was established. Arthur spent most of the day with her. He read her stories, brought her puzzles and colored pencils. He discovered she was bright, curious, and had a shy sense of humor that emerged slowly, like a cautious flower blooming after a frost. But the shadow of loss and abandonment was still there. Sometimes, in the middle of a laugh, her eyes would cloud over, and Arthur knew she was thinking of her parents. One evening, she was drawing in her sketchbook, the same one Jonas had found. She showed Arthur a new drawing, the same house as before, but this time the little girl was standing outside, looking through the window at the man and woman inside. "I miss them," she said in a low voice, not looking at him. "I know," Arthur replied, his heart aching. "I miss someone, too." It was the first time he had spoken of Sophia to anyone in years. In that moment, they weren't the billionaire and the orphan girl. They were just two lonely souls, connected by the universal language of grief. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, but a new and formidable obstacle was appearing on the horizon. Leah's physical recovery was progressing well, and she would soon be discharged. The question was, discharged to where? The state's child protective services, which she had fled, were already moving to reclaim custody. The thought of sending her back into the same system that had failed her so miserably was unbearable to Arthur. But what could he do? He had no legal claim on her. He was, in the eyes of the law, just a benefactor, and the clock was ticking. The threat of the social services system hung over the fragile peace Arthur and Leah had built. Social workers, well-meaning but overworked, began visiting the hospital, bringing forms, asking questions, and talking about the best interest of the child, a phrase that sounded hollow and bureaucratic to Arthur. They saw Leah as case 734, a statistic to be processed and filed away. They didn't see the little girl who was afraid of the dark and could only sleep if a small nightlight was left on. They didn't know her passion for drawing horses or the way she crinkled her nose when she found something funny. Arthur mobilized his formidable legal team. The lawyers, accustomed to handling billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions, now found themselves immersed in the complexities of family law. They explained the bleak situation to Arthur. As he was not a relative, his options were limited. He could try to become a licensed foster parent, a long and invasive process. Adoption was an even more remote and time-consuming possibility. The state had priority, and unless they could prove the system was actively harmful, which was notoriously difficult, Leah would be returned to it. Arthur's frustration was immense. He could buy companies, influence markets, and fund research that could change the world, yet he was powerless to protect a single child from being swallowed by an impersonal machine. His fortune, which could solve so many problems, seemed useless against the rigidity of the law. The situation deeply affected Leah. The presence of the social workers made her anxious and withdrawn. The cheerful girl who had begun to emerge in recent days retreated, replaced by a frightened, silent child. She clung to Arthur with a quiet desperation, her large, pleading eyes following him around the room. One afternoon, a social worker named Miss Davis, a stern-looking woman with tired eyes, explained the plan. Leah would be transferred to a new, supposedly better group home as soon as she was fully medically cleared. "It's standard procedure, Mr. Sterling," she said, devoid of emotion. "We appreciate your generosity, but from this point on, The state will assume responsibility. After she left, Leah curled up on the bed, hugging her knees. "I don't want to go," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to be alone again." Arthur's heart broke. "You're not alone, Leah," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm here." "But you won't be there," she sobbed. "It's cold there. Nobody cares. They just want us to be quiet." Her description was a blow. He knew she was right. He couldn't let it happen. That night, Arthur barely slept. He paced his hotel room, his mind racing. There was a war inside him. One part, the pragmatic businessman, told him to be rational, to set up a trust fund for Leah, ensure she had the best education money could buy, and monitor her from a distance. It would be the logical solution, the one that minimized risk and emotional entanglement. But the other part, the part that had been a father, the part that had held Sophia's hand until her last breath, screamed that it wasn't enough. Leah didn't need a trust fund. She needed a family. She needed love, stability, someone to tuck her in at night and help her with her homework. She needed a father. The idea was terrifying. He was 50 years old. His life was a routine of work, travel, and controlled loneliness. To be a father again, it was something he had never even allowed himself to consider. The pain of losing Sophia had been so great that he had built impenetrable walls around his heart. Opening himself up to love another child meant opening himself up to the possibility of that unbearable pain all over again. Would it be a betrayal of Sophia's memory? Or would it be the greatest tribute he could pay her, continuing the cycle of love she had taught him? The next morning, he returned to the hospital with a new determination in his eyes. He found Leah sitting up in bed, staring blankly out the window, lost in her own dark thoughts. He approached and, instead of sitting in the chair beside the bed, he sat on the floor, leaning against the wall so they were almost at the same level. "Leah," he began, his voice a little unsteady. "I've been thinking a lot. About you, about me, about the future." She turned her head slowly, her eyes wary. "And I know you're scared," he continued, "and to be honest, I am too. But the thought of you going somewhere you won't be happy, I can't accept that." He paused, gathering all his courage. "So, I wanted to ask you something. It's a big question, and maybe a silly one, but what would you think about coming to live with me? Not just for a little while, forever." Leah's eyes widened. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of two lives, two solitudes, and a fragile possibility of hope. She said nothing, just stared at him, her mouth slightly open in shock as the implications of that monumental offer began to sink into her young, yet already so weary, mind. The silence that followed Arthur's question was so thick it seemed to have weight and shape. Leah stared at him with an intensity that disarmed him, her large brown eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation, of falsehood. She had learned the hard way not to trust promises. To her, the words of adults were often like leaves in the wind, there one moment and gone the next. Arthur held her gaze, his heart hammering. He had exposed his vulnerability, offered up a piece of his heart he had kept locked away for a decade. Rejection would be painful, but he had to know. He had to try. Slowly, as if afraid a sudden move might break the spell. Leah shook her head. "Why?" she whispered, her voice fragile, but the question as sharp as glass. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." The brutal honesty of the question hit him. She wasn't being ungrateful. She was being cautious. She was protecting herself. Arthur took a deep breath. A rehearsed or sentimental answer wouldn't do. She deserved the truth. "You're right. We haven't known each other long," he admitted. "But sometimes you meet someone and you just know. You remind me of someone I loved very much, someone who taught me that the most important thing in life is to take care of each other." He hesitated, the mention of Sophia still a raw wound. "And to be honest, Leah, I think I need you too. My house is too big and too quiet. I think you'd make it a better place." Tears began to roll silently down Leah's face. They weren't the tears of sadness or fear he had seen before. They were tears of a complex emotion, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and an overwhelming hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a very long time. You mean like a dad?" she asked, the word coming out as a sob. The word hit him with the force of a wave. Dad. It was a title he thought he would never hold again. "Yes, Leah," he said, his voice thick. "If you'll have me, I'd like to try to be your dad." In that instant, the final barrier inside her broke. With a cry that was part sob, part joy, she threw herself forward, reaching for him. Arthur stood and wrapped her in a hug, pulling her close to his chest. Her small body trembled with the force of her emotions. He held her tight, feeling her warmth, the smell of hospital shampoo in her hair. And he knew, with a certainty that transcended any deal or investment he had ever made, that this was real. This was what mattered. That moment of pure emotional connection was the climax of their journey so far. It was the resolution of Arthur's internal conflict and the answer to Leah's helplessness. But the outside world had not disappeared. The room door opened without a knock, and Miss Davis, the social worker, entered with a folder in her hand. She stopped short, taking in the scene with an unreadable expression. Arthur straightened up, but kept a protective arm around Leah's shoulders. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Davis," he began, "I've made a decision." "So have I, Mr. Sterling," she interrupted him, her tone softer than usual. "I've been looking into your background, and I've also been investigating the culture of your hospital." She opened the folder. "I found that, prior to your intervention, other cases like Leah's were mishandled. Vulnerable patients were consistently discouraged from seeking treatment here." Arthur's stomach turned. It was the confirmation of his worst fear. "But I also found out what you've done since," she continued. "I spoke with Dr. Aldrich. I learned of your order to establish a fund, the Sophia Fund, to guarantee free pediatric emergency treatment for any child, regardless of ability to pay." She looked from Arthur to Leah, and for the first time he saw compassion in her eyes. "The law is rigid, Mr. Sterling, but sometimes it has room for common sense. Given the circumstances, and with your pledge to immediately begin the formal adoption process, I am prepared to recommend to the court that Leah be released into your temporary custody." The air left Arthur's lungs in a whoosh of relief. It was the victory he had barely dared to hope for. Leah, who had understood enough of the conversation, squeezed his hand tightly, her face lit with a smile so radiant it seemed to fill the entire room. The legal battle was won. The emotional battle was won. They had a path forward, together. As Ms. Davis explained the next steps, Arthur's gaze drifted to the window. The afternoon sun bathed the city in a golden light. He felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. The enormous weight of his fortune, which once burdened him, now felt different. It was no longer a burden, but a tool that, when wielded with wisdom and heart, could not only build hospitals, but could rebuild lives and create families in the most unexpected of places. The biggest transaction of his life had involved no stocks or cryptocurrency, but a simple hug in a hospital room, and the return on that investment was infinite. The weeks that followed Leah's discharge were a whirlwind of adjustments and discoveries. The transition from the sterile hospital room to Arthur's vast, silent mansion was, at first, overwhelming for both of them. For Leah, it was like stepping into a fairy tale castle. The high ceilings, endless hallways, and elegant furniture were so unlike anything she had ever known that she tiptoed everywhere, as if afraid she might break something just by looking at it. For Arthur, the house, which for a decade had been merely a functional space, a solitary refuge, suddenly began to transform into a home. The sound of Leah's small feet pattering on the marble, her laughter echoing where there had only been silence, and the sight of her colorful drawings affixed with magnets to the stainless steel refrigerator door were seismic shifts in his carefully controlled routine. The resolution of the external conflicts began with a ruthless restructuring at the Claremont Medical Center. Arthur wasn't content with just firing Richard and Beatrice. He called an emergency meeting with the entire board and senior management. There, he not only announced the creation of the Sophia Fund, but detailed a new institutional philosophy. The motto, "Every child deserves care, regardless of circumstance," was engraved on bronze plaques and installed at the main entrance. New protocols were implemented, focusing on humanized triage. Empathy training became mandatory for all employees, from reception to the executive suite. He promoted Helen, the nurse who had shown compassion, to head of pediatric nursing and gave Dr. Allen a generous research grant to develop community health outreach programs. The hospital that had nearly denied aid to a desperate child was step by step becoming a sanctuary. The transformation was not without resistance. Some board members, concerned with cash flow and profitability, questioned the financial sustainability of the Sophia Fund. Arthur responded by transferring a significant portion of his personal shares into the fund, ensuring its perpetuity. "True wealth," he told the board, "is not in the dividends we pay shareholders, but in the lives we save. This hospital will not just be a profitable business, it will be a legacy of compassion." At home, the personal narrative arcs also found their denouement. The adoption process, while complex, moved swiftly, buoyed by Arthur's influence and Ms. Davis's favorable recommendation. The lawyers handled the paperwork, but the real adoption happened in the day-to-day. It happened when Arthur patiently taught Leah to ride a bike in the sprawling gardens, running behind her with a hand on her back, just as he had with Sophia. It happened when Leah, after a nightmare, ran to Arthur's room, and he welcomed her into his bed, telling her stories until she fell asleep again. It happened when they found Sophia's old room. Arthur had kept it untouched for years, a museum of his grief. One day, Leah, curious, opened the door. Instead of jealousy or resentment, Arthur felt an unexpected peace. He sat on the bed with Leah and, for the first time, spoke at length about Sophia, about her laugh, her love for blue dogs, her kindness. He showed Leah pictures, and Leah listened intently, her head resting on his shoulder. "She was pretty," Leah said softly. "She would have liked you," Arthur replied, and as he said it, he realized it was true. Loving Leah didn't diminish his love for Sophia, it honored it. That afternoon, they decided together to redecorate the room. Not to erase Sophia, but to create a new space that belonged to Leah, a space that could hold new memories and new joys. They painted the walls a sunny yellow, Leah's favorite color, and hung her drawings next to a framed picture of Sophia. It was the perfect fusion of the past and the future. Leah, for her part, blossomed. The security and unconditional love were the fertile soil her soul needed. The scared, withdrawn girl gave way to a vibrant, confident child. She started a new school, made friends, and discovered a talent for painting. The word alone vanished from her drawings, replaced by images of her new life, her and Arthur riding bikes, eating ice cream, reading books together. The family she had lost would never be forgotten, but the new family she had found was healing the wound, turning the scar into a symbol of resilience. The outcome for Beatrice and Richard was quiet, but definitive. The for cause termination on their records made it nearly impossible for them to find similar positions at other prestigious institutions. Their actions, born of prejudice and ambition, led them to a professional ostracism that was the natural consequence of their lack of humanity. They were not comic book villains, but ordinary people who made cruel choices, and the world Arthur was now building had no room for them. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful day in the hospital lobby. To the outside world, it was the blink of an eye, a brief interlude in the ceaseless flow of life. But for Arthur and Leah, it had been an eternity. A period of transformation so profound that the life before seemed to belong to someone else, to an old black and white film. Now, their life was in vivid color. That Saturday afternoon, sun streamed through the mansion's windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny fairies. Arthur was in the kitchen, trying, with little success, to follow a pancake recipe he'd found online. There was flour on his cashmere sweater and a smudge of batter on his cheek. Leah sat at the kitchen island, giggling at his culinary ineptitude while sketching in her notebook. It was a scene of domestic bliss, so normal and yet so miraculous. Later, they went to the hospital, not for a medical appointment, but for an unveiling. The marble lobby, the stage of Leah's humiliation, was different. It retained its elegance, but it now pulsed with a warmth it had lacked before. In the center, where the monumental flower arrangement once stood, there was now a playful bronze sculpture of children playing. On the wall behind the reception desk, the new plaque with the motto, "Every child deserves care," gleamed under the soft light. The new receptionist, an older woman with a genuine smile, greeted a humble-looking family with the same courtesy and warmth she gave a couple who arrived in a luxury car. The change was real, palpable. They were there for the official opening of the new pediatric wing, renamed the Sophia and Leah Sterling Wing. The ceremony was quiet, no press, just the hospital staff. Arthur gave a short speech, not as the billionaire owner, but as a father. He spoke about how, sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places, and how the true measure of any institution, or any person, is how they treat the most vulnerable among them. He looked down at Leah, who was holding his hand, his eyes welling up. "This wing," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is dedicated to two girls who taught me the true meaning of the word, wealth. One taught me how to love unconditionally, and the other taught me to never again take that love for granted." After the ceremony, as they walked hand in hand down the corridor, Leah stopped and looked back at the lobby. "Do you remember?" she asked quietly. "I was so scared." "I remember," Arthur said, kneeling to be at her eye level. "Oh, but you were very brave, braver than anyone else here." "You were my angel," she said, touching his face. "Mommy used to say, God sends disguised angels when we need them most. Your disguise wasn't very good, though. Your clothes were kind of old." Arthur laughed, a genuine, deep laugh that came from his soul. "I guess I'll have to work on that." They walked out of the hospital into the late afternoon sun. The life ahead wouldn't be a perfect fairy tale. There would be challenges, teenage tantrums, broken hearts, and all the aches and joys that make up a life. But they would face it together. The man who watched the world from his ivory tower had learned that true fortune wasn't stored in vaults or invested in stocks. It was in the small hand holding his, in the trust of a gaze, in the chance to heal not just a child's body, but also his own soul. The girl who had been called a vagrant had found a home, not just in a house, but in the heart of a man who saw in her not her tragic past, but a brilliant future. The echo of that cruel phrase, "We don't treat vagrants here," had finally been silenced, replaced by the soft sound of a new family finding its way, proving that the greatest transformations are born not from power or money, but from a simple act of humanity that dares to say, "I care."